Dawn crept over the tower like a ghost reluctant to be seen. The first light did not bring warmth, only a thin, colorless glow that revealed the scaffold waiting on the green. The air was heavy, soaked with the smell of damp earth and iron. Beyond the walls, the city still slept, but here, in this enclosed world of stone and silence, a queen awaited her end. Anne Boleyn stood beneath the pale sky, her breath misting in the chill air. The silk of her gown whispered against the wood as she moved, a whisper almost lost to the sound of distant bells. Somewhere beyond the tower, London stirred. Carts rumbled, vendors called, life went on. But inside these walls, time had stopped. Every heartbeat, every breath was counted, measured, and finite. The ground beneath her feet had seen centuries of blood and betrayal. Kings had built their power upon it, and traitors had fallen into it. Yet no execution had carried this much silence, this much waiting. The crowd that gathered was not large, nobles, guards, a few of her household women weeping quietly into their sleeves. They did not speak her name. None dared. Above her, the tower loomed, its stones blackened by age, its windows blind and watchful. It had been her prison, her chapel, her tomb even before she died. She had walked those corridors once as queen, certain that the world would bend to her will. Now those same walls listened for the sound of her final prayer. Her lips moved faintly, and though no one could hear the words, they could see their meaning. Forgiveness, faith, surrender. Yet behind the calm was something else. A strange, steady light in her eyes. The same gaze that once held a king was now fixed on eternity. Some said she was brave. Others whispered she had gone mad. But perhaps she had simply understood what few ever do, that there are worse things than dying. That the true cruelty was not in the sword, but in the waiting, in the spectacle, in being turned from a woman into a warning. A soft wind moved across Tower Green, bending the grass like a field in mourning. A gull cried above the river, sharp and fleeting, and the sound vanished into the mist. The crowd shifted, restless, expectant. Somewhere inside the tower, the executioner waited, the man brought from France for the honor of taking her life cleanly. He sharpened his blade not in haste, but in ceremony. Even death was choreographed here, and lifted her eyes to the sky. The dawn light touched her face, pale and still, as if she already belonged to another world. She did not look for mercy. She knew no messenger would come galloping through the gates. No reprieve, no pardon, no miracle. Only the certainty of steel and silence. What truly happened that morning, when the world watched a queen fall? What was spoken? What was concealed? And what was done to her even after the blade had fallen? Because what history remembers is not always what it witnessed. And beneath the official story lies something darker. A truth too cruel to fit within the pages of a chronicle. If you value the truth beneath the myths, subscribe to Echoes of Time, where we uncover the parts history tried to bury. The days before that final morning unfolded in silence, broken only by the echo of footsteps and the scraping of iron keys against stone. Within the cold walls of the tower, Anne Boleyn waited. Not for justice, not for mercy, but for confirmation of what she already knew. The court had spoken her guilt long before her trial began. Her enemies had woven the verdict with threads of fear and ambition, and now the web had closed around her completely. Thomas Cromwell, the king's most cunning architect, moved in shadows she could not reach. Once her ally, now her executioner in all but name. He needed her gone, not for morality or faith but for power. Every whisper from the tower, every rumor beyond its gates, had been shaped by his hand. The charges were many, the witnesses rehearsed, the outcome inevitable. Henry VIII no longer spoke her name. The man who once risked heaven for her now pretended she had never existed. In her confinement, she was told nothing of his thoughts. No message, no word of pity. Only silence. A silence that screamed louder than any accusation. It was said he spent his nights feasting, hunting, laughing with the courtiers who had already begun to praise his next queen. For Anne, that silence was the cruelest betrayal of all. In her narrow chamber, she wrote letters. Desperate, pleading, measured, still believing that truth could reach him. She called him my lord, my husband, my king. She reminded him of their vows, of their child, of the love that once changed the world. No reply came. The letters vanished into the corridors of power, intercepted, buried, unread. Every day, the sound of the chapel bell marked the hours. Every night, she heard the tower ravens, restless, circling the roofs above her. The women who attended her tried to speak of hope, but she saw in their eyes that they already mourned her. She could feel the kingdom moving on without her, the way the tide erases footprints in the sand. There was no rage in her now, only a quiet awareness. The game she had once mastered was being played without her. Each ally she thought she had was now a witness, each friend a liability. The court she had ruled with wit and grace now whispered her name like a curse. She asked to see her brother, George, but he too had been condemned. Their fates were bound together in the same cruel design. In the darkness, she must have wondered how it had all turned so quickly. How love had become treason, how a crown had become a sentence. The tower became her mirror. Every stone reminded her of what she had built and what had been taken. Her enemies did not need to torture her body. They broke her with absence, stripping her of voice, of dignity, of hope. She lived surrounded by guards, but it was the silence that imprisoned her. Would you have trusted anyone in that court? Tell us in the comments before we continue. The 15th of May, 1536. The air inside the great hall of the tower was stifling, thick with perfume and fear. Every noble summoned to sit in judgment that day owed his fortune, his title, or his very life to the king. They came not as arbiters of justice, but as witnesses to a decision already made. The stage was set before the players arrived. Anne Boleyn was brought in through a narrow door, her head held high though the chains of accusation hung heavy around her. She wore a gown of deep crimson, the color of martyrdom and defiance. No crown, no jewels, only dignity. The murmurs fell to silence as she entered, and for a moment, even her enemies could not look away. At the center of the hall sat her judges, 26 peers of the realm, gathered beneath the shadow of royal command. Among them were men who had once sworn loyalty to her, men who had knelt before her as queen. Their faces were masks now, drained of conviction, fixed in obedience. The Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, presided, his eyes cold, his voice unwavering. When he read the charges aloud, he did not falter, though every word condemned his own blood. She stood accused of adultery, of incest, of conspiring the king's death. The charges were absurd, each one crafted with care to humiliate, not just destroy. Her alleged lovers had already been tried, already executed, their confessions extracted under pressure or forged outright. The verdicts against them were read as proof of her guilt. The circle of lies was perfect, self-feeding, unbreakable. An eyewitness, Sir William Kingston, constable of the Tower, would later write of her composure. He said she looked never more ready to make answer for herself. In that hall, surrounded by betrayal, she spoke clearly, calmly, and with reason. She denied each charge with precision, not pleading for mercy, but demanding truth. Her voice carried, steady and haunting, echoing against the stone walls that had seen so many condemned before her. She reminded the court that she was a crowned queen of England, the mother of the king's child, and that to accuse her without evidence was not justice, but spectacle. Yet even as she spoke, the scribes wrote her guilt into the record. Every word of her defense was shadowed by the rustle of quills recording her fall. When her statement ended, there was no deliberation. The peers rose, each pronouncing her guilty in turn. Some bowed their heads in shame. Others did not bother to disguise their relief. The Duke of Norfolk's voice cut through the silence as he delivered the sentence: to be burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure. The choice of how she would die belonged, as everything once had, to Henry. Through it all, and did not weep. Her grace unsettled them. She thanked the court for their judgment, prayed that God would forgive those who condemned her, and bowed as if leaving a banquet rather than a tribunal. It was not innocence that saved her pride. It was the knowledge that they could destroy her body but not her name. As she was led out, the murmurs returned, rising like the hiss of a serpent. Some swore she smiled. Others claimed her eyes glistened not with tears, but with something fiercer, the last remnants of power refusing to die quietly. Even knowing she'd lose, she argued her innocence. Would you have had that courage? The trial ended, but death did not come, and was returned to her chamber in the tower, where time no longer moved as it did for others. The days that followed were not filled with torture or rage. They were filled with silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to seep into the stone. Each dawn brought the same uncertainty. Would it be today? Would the footsteps in the corridor stop at her door? Henry hesitated. Some said it was pity. Others whispered it was cruelty. He had ordered that a swordsman be brought from Calais, a man famed for his skill, swift and precise, capable of ending a life with one clean stroke. It was said to be mercy, but mercy delayed is not mercy at all. The waiting was its own execution, carried out hour by hour, thought by thought, and asked how long she must endure this torment. The constable of the tower, Sir William Kingston, could not answer. His letters describe her composure, her strange peace. Never did she look more gay, he wrote, though it was not joy but courage wearing the mask of calm. She laughed, spoke gently to her ladies, and prayed without ceasing. But in the quiet moments, when she believed herself unobserved, her face would turn toward the window, toward the world she would never see again. She made her final requests. She wished to confess and to take the sacrament, to leave this life reconciled with God. She spoke not of vengeance, not even of her child, but of the soul. Her chaplain, moved by her serenity, said that she showed a devout heart and a pure conscience. To those who feared to look at her, she offered comfort. To those who wept, she offered forgiveness. Her wit did not desert her even here. When told the swordsman had been delayed by rough seas, she smiled faintly and said, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have but a little neck." It was gallows humor from a woman who had nothing left to protect but her dignity. Her attendants wept, but she soothed them, saying, "Do not grieve, for you will receive no such end as mine." She ate little. The night before her death, she took a simple meal, bread, wine, and small comforts she barely touched. Her hands trembled only once, when the cup slipped slightly between her fingers. She watched the candlelight flicker on the wall and said softly, "It will soon be over." Outside, the tower ravens gathered on the battlements, restless. Inside, the air grew still as though the place itself were listening. The order would come at dawn. Until then, she waited, suspended between life and legend, between a kingdom's betrayal and eternity's embrace. If this glimpse into her humanity moves you, join echoes of time. We bring forgotten souls back to life. The morning of May 19th broke clear and windless. The mist that had hung over the river lifted slowly, revealing the tower in its stark, unmerciful light. The order had come. The waiting was over. On Tower Green, carpenters had worked through the night. A small scaffold stood at the center of the space. Not high like those used for common criminals, but close to the ground, almost intimate. It was built for ceremony, not spectacle. The crowd was handpicked. A few noblemen, guards, and the women of her household. No mobs, no shouting throngs. The king had commanded that her death be quiet, controlled, unchaotic. A performance measured down to its final breath. The scaffold boards were fresh, pale, and rough beneath her feet. The morning light struck the surface like a stage. Around it, soldiers held their posts in stillness. The only movement came from the flutter of banners and the tremor of human breath. Anne Boleyn stepped forward, her gown a deep gray trimmed with fur. Her hair had been bound beneath a linen cap, her face uncovered. She moved with the grace of someone attending her own coronation, not her death. Her composure unsettled even those who had come to watch her die. Some lowered their eyes as she passed. Others studied her, as if hoping to see guilt in her expression. When she mounted the scaffold, she turned to the small assembly and spoke. Her voice carried clearly through the morning air, soft, controlled, and without bitterness. She declared she had come to die according to the law, and that she would accuse no one of wrongdoing. She prayed for the king, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord, and asked God to preserve him and the realm. There was no plea for justice, no curse, no mention of innocence. Her words were chosen to grant her the only freedom left, the freedom to die with dignity. Her attendants wept as she removed her cloak and handed it to one of them. She knelt upright on the straw-strewn boards, refusing the block that most condemned were forced to use. Her hands folded before her, she lifted her eyes to the heavens and whispered her last prayer. Behind her, the French swordsman waited, dressed in black. He had arrived quietly from Calais days earlier, famed for his precision and his mercy. He stepped lightly across the scaffold, speaking softly to his assistants in French so that she would not hear the signal. He asked for his sword. It was hidden beneath the straw, not raised in warning but concealed, ready to strike without fear or flinch. He moved with practiced ease. In one smooth motion, he called for his servant to fetch the weapon. A feint meant to draw her gaze away, and as she turned her head slightly, the blade flashed. The crowd gasped once, then silence. The sword fell true, swift as a whisper. Her body did not struggle, her lips did not cry out. For a heartbeat, perhaps two, the world seemed to stop. Some later claimed that the eyes still moved, that her lips formed the shape of a prayer. Others swore they saw nothing at all, only stillness. Physicians centuries later would argue whether consciousness lingers for a few fleeting seconds after the head is severed. A moment where thought persists though the body is gone. We cannot know. Perhaps she saw nothing. Perhaps she saw everything. The executioner lifted the head, held it briefly before the witnesses, then laid it gently beside the body. There was no cheer, no proclamation. Only the toll of a single bell from the Tower Chapel, carried faintly by the morning wind. Some say her calm defied her killers. Others say she was broken long before. Where do you stand? The moment the blade fell, and Boleyn's body ceased to belong to the world. The courtiers who had bowed to her, the guards who had feared her name, the hands that had built the scaffold, all withdrew in uneasy silence. The executioner wiped his sword clean and left the platform without ceremony. No prayers were read over her remains. No procession, no mourning cloth. What followed was not a royal burial, but an erasure. Her attendants, numb with shock, were ordered to gather her body. They found no coffin prepared, no shroud fit for a queen. Desperate, they searched the tower and found an old arrow chest once used for storing weapons. It was too short for her frame, but it was all that could be given. They folded her limbs carefully, placed her head beside her body, and laid her within the wooden box. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula stood only steps away, the church of the condemned, where traitors and queens alike were buried beneath unmarked stones. They carried her there at dusk. The floor of the chapel was cold, its flagstones uneven, stained with the dust of those who had come before her. No mass was sung, no herald cried her name. A few whispered prayers from her ladies were the only farewell she received. Then the chest was lowered into the earth, beneath the chancel pavement, beside the bodies of the men condemned in her name. The slab was sealed, the floor swept, and by nightfall, England's former queen had vanished. In the days that followed, her possessions disappeared from court. The emblem she once wore, the falcon crowned upon a branch, was stripped from walls and garments. Her portrait in the royal chambers was removed. The coins struck with her initial were melted and remade. It was as though she had never existed, as though the years of her reign had been a fever dream the realm was eager to forget. Even the records of her trial were edited, words erased, names altered. History itself was forced to bend in obedience to the king's new peace. Centuries passed. The tower endured storms, wars, and new monarchs, but the earth beneath St. Peter ad Vincula held its silence. Then, in 1876, the chapel was restored. The workmen who lifted the stones discovered several skeletons beneath them. Among them, the remains of a woman, small and delicate, the bones of the neck cleanly severed. Some believed they had found Anne Boleyn. Others doubted, arguing that time had jumbled the dead beyond recognition. Yet even the uncertainty seemed fitting. Her erasure had been so complete that not even her resting place could speak her name with certainty. Her body may have been buried, but her absence became its own presence. The deliberate forgetting was a second execution. One meant to strip her not of life, but of meaning. Her name, her likeness, her story, all rewritten to serve the power that destroyed her. Yet even in silence she endured. Whispers of her beauty, her intelligence, her wit survived in letters, in songs, in the quiet rebellion of memory. They tried to erase her, but we remember. Subscribe so her story isn't silenced again. Only 11 days after Anne Boleyn's death, the bells of London rang again, this time not in mourning, but in celebration. Henry VIII had remarried. The bride was Jane Seymour, quiet and compliant, the mirror opposite of the woman who had just been erased. The ink on Anne's death warrant had barely dried when the king stood before the altar once more, his expression serene, his conscience cleansed by his own decree. To the court it was a display of obedience, a lesson in how swiftly loyalty must change hands. Courtiers who had once sworn devotion to and now bent their knees to Jane without hesitation. The same mouths that had praised the former queen's grace now spoke of her arrogance, her witchcraft, her deserved fall. Fear moved through the corridors of Whitehall like smoke. Every noble, every servant, every ambassador understood the message. Truth was what the king said it was, and it could change at any moment. Behind the facade of pageantry, the machinery of narrative control began to turn. Records of Anne's trial were adjusted. Her letters disappeared. New chronicles painted her as a seductress, a manipulator who had ensnared a virtuous king. Her story was no longer a tragedy, it was a warning to any woman who might think herself greater than her husband, to any subject who might question the crown. The Tudor court turned her life into propaganda, her death into moral instruction. In private, some whispered doubts. The ambassadors of Spain and France, writing to their monarchs, spoke of the unease that lingered over England. They described a king who laughed too loudly, who forced cheer upon a court still shrouded in fear. One wrote that the people murmur quietly that the queen was wronged, yet none dares to speak. Silence became survival. To remember her kindly was treason. To question her guilt was death. Henry's new marriage was paraded as divine correction, proof that God had removed the sinner to make way for purity. Jane Seymour's obedience was exalted as virtue, her quietness as wisdom. Where Anne had been passion and argument, Jane was acquiescence. The image was complete. The fallen queen cast as warning, the new queen as reward. The king had not only destroyed a woman, he had reshaped history to justify it. It was not merely personal cruelty, it was design. A ruler who could alter faith itself, who could sever his kingdom from Rome with a word, could also bend the truth to his will. The chronicles written under his reign told not what had happened, but what must be believed. The living learned to repeat it. The dead had no voice to contradict. If your ruler could rewrite truth overnight, would you speak or stay silent? Tell us below. Time moved on, and with it, the kingdom Anne Boleyn had helped to create. The tower still stood, its stones dark with memory, but the world beyond its walls began to change. Years turned into decades, decades into generations, and the shadow of her name lingered, unspoken, yet never gone. Then, in 1558, the silence broke. A young woman ascended the throne of England, pale-haired, sharp-eyed, and unmistakably her mother's daughter. Elizabeth I, the child Anne Boleyn had once feared she would never see grow, now wore the crown that her mother had died to give. The daughter of the condemned queen stood before her people as their sovereign, and the ghost of her mother rose with her. The court that had once destroyed Anne's name now whispered it again, but this time with awe. Chroniclers began to soften their words, to question the verdict handed down 2 decades before. The memory of Anne, once a cautionary tale, began to shift. She became the martyr of intellect, the symbol of reform, the spark that had ignited a new age. Those who had cursed her ambition now praised her foresight. History, slow and merciless, began to undo its lie. Artifacts survived, fragile relics of a life that refused to vanish. The golden pendant, worn proudly at her throat in life, appeared in later portraits of Elizabeth, reimagined as a silent tribute. Prayers written in Anne's own hand still whispered of faith, humility, and endurance. A few portraits, once hidden, resurfaced, their colors softened by time. In each, her gaze was steady, her expression neither proud nor ashamed, only unyielding. Scholars centuries later would search through letters, confessions, and records, finding contradictions, manipulations, and missing pages. What had been called justice revealed itself as strategy. What had been condemned as sin began to look like courage. The woman erased by power was being rewritten by time itself. Yet, even in vindication, her story remained uneasy. For every admirer who called her victim or visionary, there were others who saw in her the dangerous spark of human ambition, a reminder that brilliance and ruin often walk hand in hand. The truth of Anne Boleyn was neither saintly nor sinister. It was human and therefore immortal. The echo of her name reached beyond the Tudor age, beyond the Tower, beyond the centuries. Each retelling changed her, yet could never silence her. She had become what Henry never intended: unforgettable. If you've made it this far, you already walk with us through history. Tap subscribe and keep her memory alive. What made Anne Boleyn's story truly terrible was not the blade, but what followed it. Her death was swift, her erasure was methodical. In life, she had been powerful, a woman whose intelligence could move kings, whose words could shift the course of nations. But in death, that power became dangerous. The Tudors did not simply kill her. They dismantled her, piece by piece, until she was no longer a person, but a lesson. The propaganda that followed her execution was a masterpiece of control. Chroniclers wrote that she had bewitched the king, that her ambition had poisoned his judgment. Her sharp mind became deceit, her charm became manipulation, her courage became pride. In the same breath that England broke from Rome, its rulers created a mythology to justify the blood that had sealed the change. Anne was cast not as the mother of a future queen, but as the witch who had nearly ruined a kingdom. The Tudor dynasty depended on it. If Anne was innocent, then Henry was a murderer, and the divine right of his throne would crumble. This rewriting of truth was not unique to her age. It is a pattern older than empires, repeating wherever power fears the voice of the outcast. When a woman rose too high, she became a warning. When a ruler's cruelty was questioned, history was rewritten to make the cruelty look necessary. In every century, the victors shaped memory to protect their power. The ink of record has always been as dangerous as the edge of the sword. Centuries later, the same tools remain, though they no longer bear the Tudor seal. The stories we tell, the headlines we believe, the reputations built and destroyed in moments, all serve the same old purpose: to command the narrative before truth can breathe. What happened to Anne was not just a tragedy of the past. It is the template of how societies decide who deserves to be remembered and who must be forgotten. Yet Anne Boleyn endures. Stripped of her crown, denied her voice, she survives not as a victim, but as an idea, the resilience of thought, the defiance of silence. Her intelligence could be condemned, but not buried. Her failure was turned into a warning, yet it became her immortality. She was broken by the world of men, but through time, she rose again through the words of women and the curiosity of history itself. Her story matters because it exposes how fragile truth can be, and how fiercely it must be protected. The myths around her were built to obscure her humanity, but in those very myths, she remains visible. The more they tried to shape her into a monster, the clearer her reflection became: flawed, brilliant, unrelenting. What lesson do you see in her story? I read every comment. The tower stands quiet now. Centuries have passed, and yet the grass of Tower Green still grows differently where she fell. Softer, paler, as though memory itself has taken root beneath the soil. The wind moves through the open space in slow, deliberate sighs, brushing against the old stones that have seen too much to ever forget. The scaffold is gone. Its wood long decayed, but the silence remains, dense and watchful. At dawn, when the city beyond the walls is still half asleep, the light strikes the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and spills across the ground where Anne Boleyn once knelt. The sound of the river carries faintly from the Thames, the same river that bore the whispers of her trial, the same tide that once washed the blood of her age into history. There are no guards now, no executioner waiting behind her, no crowd bound by fear, only the emptiness and the echo of what was done here. Visitors walk the green, some unaware of the ground they cross. Others pause, drawn by something they cannot name, the pull of a story unfinished. They stand where she once stood and feel, perhaps for a moment, the thin veil between the present and the past. The tower does not speak, but the air itself seems to remember her. In the stillness, it becomes clear. The truth outlives the hands that try to bury it. Kings die, dynasties fade, but the echo of injustice endures. Every lie carved into record, every name erased for convenience, eventually trembles beneath the weight of time. What survives is not power, but consequence. Not the decree of rulers, but the endurance of memory. Anne Boleyn's story was written to end with her death, yet it refuses to end. It lingers in the language of history, in the gaze of her portraits, in the reign of her daughter who proved that a woman could rule the world that killed her mother. The truth she carried did not die with her. It scattered, like dust in sunlight, finding its way into every corner history tried to seal. When we speak her name now, it is not in fear or accusation, but in remembrance. She is no longer the traitor they described, nor the saint some wish her to be. She is what time allows her to become: human, enduring, necessary. A voice once silenced that continues to be heard, centuries after her breath has gone. The tower remains, but it no longer belongs to her captors. It belongs to her shadow, to the silence that speaks louder than all their decrees. This is Echoes of Time, where voices like Anne's are never lost to silence. Subscribe, share, and tell me in the comments why you think her story still haunts us today.